Hello friends, Steve Stockton here with you. Welcome to our latest video. In this episode, we take a look at the 1902 unsolved murder of Nora Fuller. Join us. While we talk all the time on this channel about mainly unsolved disappearances, the fact of the matter is that nowadays crimes get solved relatively quickly, whether for better or for worse. Since the turn of the 20th century, scientific and technological advancements have made it not only easier for authorities to solve more cases more quickly, but some might say, aside from the exceptions that are taking place right under their noses in the woods, which is the main theme of this channel, it's almost impossible to get away with murder these days. But what about way back when? At the turn of the 20th century. Before DNA, the internet, YouTube, social media, armchair detectives, instant access to information, and everything else our society has now that would seem impossible to those who lived way back then, we want to take you back in time in this new series. We want to look at missing persons cases and unsolved disappearances throughout history, starting, for now, with the first decade of the 1900s. Let us know how you like this series, and perhaps we can go back even further and see not only how things were done, but to look at the cases that more than 100 years later still have no rhyme or reason, or at the very least, still haven't been officially solved. Come and take a walk with us, folks, down a creepy and macabre memory lane of sorts, and look into some of history's long unsolved cases and perhaps long forgotten cases of people who disappeared without a trace and murders never brought to justice. 15-year-old Nora Fuller lived in San Francisco in 1902. She was your average and typical teenage girl for the time and had her whole life and a bright future ahead of her. On January 10th of that same year, however, all of that would change when Nora saw an ad in the local paper advertising for a job. The ad, which appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle, stated someone was, quote, looking for a young girl to take care of a baby, good home and good wages, end quote. Perhaps back in those days, that was enough information, as the world, even San Francisco, was much simpler and much more innocent then. Nora's mother, Alice, had recently divorced her second husband and was struggling to support Nora and her 3 siblings. Nora saw this as the perfect opportunity to chip in and help her mother out. Instead of remaining in school and getting her diploma, she decided to step up and try to relieve some of the financial burden that was very stressful on her mother. Nora and Alice discussed the advert, and eventually, with some reluctance, Alice relented and allowed Nora to respond and try to get the job. She figured the extra money would be nice and it would ease her burden a bit. Nora's original dream was working in the theater. She had even signed up with an agency. However, no opportunities were presenting themselves, and, being the eldest daughter, she and her mother were falling on hard times and were desperate to make sure the younger children had everything they needed. Nora immediately replied to the ad for what was basically a nanny to an infant and waited patiently and hopefully for a response. Just a few days later, a postcard arrived at the Fuller house explaining that Nora had been hired for the position. The postcard read as follows: Miss Fuller, in answer to yours in response to my advertisement, kindly call the popular restaurant, 55 Gary Street, and inquire for Mr. John Bennett at 1 o'clock. If you can't come at 1, come at 6. Signed, J.B. By the time she received the invitation, it was well past 1 o'clock, but she had plenty of time to make it to the restaurant for 6. Nora got dressed and put the note in her pocket along with the grocery money her mom had given her earlier that day. She was to stop at the store and do some shopping on the way back from her meeting. Approximately an hour later, Nora's brother Louis answered the phone at the house and was told by Nora that she was already at Mr. Bennett's house. She explained she had been hired on the spot and the man needed her to start immediately, and so she went with him. She told him to relay the information to their mother and that his address was 1500 Gary Street. Alice, who was there while Nora's brother was on the phone with her, told her to tell him she must return home right away and start the job at a more reasonable time, like the following Monday. It's noted that this all took place on a Saturday evening. Alice was displeased as she was waiting on the groceries Nora was supposed to have picked up in order to cook dinner for the rest of the family. Nora was obviously upset, but agreed to do as her mother said and come home after retrieving the groceries. The phone call ended, and that's the last her family ever heard from Nora. Nora never made it home. For some unknown reason, often speculated she figured she'd simply been disobeyed by her rebellious teenage daughter, Alice didn't report her daughter missing until 5 days after that last phone call. It was January 16th when she finally alerted the authorities. Nora's mother was adamant that she had been kidnapped, but the police didn't see it that way and failed to help much, if at all, in the initial investigation. They briefly spoke to a few of Nora's closest friends and discovered that one of them had recently run away from her home and thought it quite obvious Nora had done the same and would be back any time then. Unfortunately, 3 weeks later, on February 8th, they would be proven severely mistaken. On that particular day, a rent inspector named H.E. Dean visited a property at 2211 Sutter Street for his employer, Umson & Company Real Estate. It was a 2-story building and had been rented 2 months previously by a man calling himself C.B. Hawkins. Upon his arrival to collect the second month's rent from the tenant, Dean found what looked like a vacant apartment. The first floor was completely empty, and upon entering the bedroom on the second floor, he came across the body of a deceased female. Her clothes were strewn about the room, and there was no one else in sight. He ran outside and in his shock stumbled across a police officer who followed him back up into the bedroom where he had found the body. The officer's name was Gill, and he was shocked at the sight before him. It was the decomposing body would later be identified, some say by her brother Lewis, and others say it was Alice, her mother, who identified her as 15-year-old Nora Fuller. The cause of death was strangulation, and her torn clothing seemed to indicate to investigators that she had also been assaulted. She had eaten some of an apple and drank some type of alcohol within an hour of her tragic and untimely demise. Witnesses had come forward stating they had seen Nora eating an apple as she walked to her meeting on the night of the 16th, and therefore it was concluded she had been murdered within just a few hours of leaving her home that fateful night. The Sutter Street apartment yielded little to no evidence or clues, and though her purse was found, the postcard asking her to meet her alleged future employer at the popular restaurant and the grocery money Alice had given her was gone. There was an empty whiskey bottle, some junk mail addressed to C.B. Hawkins, and other than a bed, just an empty chair in the corner of the room remained. Now remember, at this time there was no such thing as DNA, and fingerprinting was still in its infancy, so there was very little that could be concluded from the crime scene, even though a cigarette butt, most likely the killer's with DNA on it, had been left behind. The investigators quickly concluded that C.B. Hawkins and Mr. Bennett were the same person, and this was backed up when several people described the man with Nora at the restaurant that night, and the description was almost exactly the same as those who had had contact with Mr. Hawkins. The owner of the popular restaurant told the police that the man who had given the name Bennett had been a regular at the restaurant for 10 years and was even known to the staff by his own nickname. The owner also stated that no woman ever showed up that night, and Mr. Bennett left alone, despite him telling his server to be sure when the young lady showed up that she be seated at his table. He gave a description of who he knew to be Bennett and also said he noticed him pacing outside the restaurant for about a half hour before leaving, seemingly alone, on the night of January 11th. Upon investigation of the address Nora had given her brother during their last conversation, where she claimed to have been with Mr. Bennett already and at his service working, they discovered it to be a vacant lot. Making this case even more strange was the coming forward of a friend of Nora's named Madge Graham, who told investigators that Nora had been having a secret romance with a much older man who went by the name Bennett. Madge claimed she had even been Nora's alibi on numerous occasions when Nora wanted to go and be with her older lover. She even went so far as to allege that the ad in the paper was simply a ruse concocted by the couple in order for them to be able to spend more time together. A local grocer named Minky seemed to back up Madge's allegations when he came forward and told the police that Nora frequently used the phone in his store, despite having one at home, to call a local hotel. Nora had a stellar reputation in the community, though, so most people gave little credence to what Madge and the grocer were saying about her. She was known as a devoted daughter and a smart girl, not as someone who would run around with a man 25 years her senior and sneak around behind her mother's back in order to eventually take off for good with a few dollars grocery money. Plus, that money was desperately needed for the family to eat. Despite a $5,000 reward being offered and a flood of tips being called in, after investigating every single one of them further, the police were no closer to having any answers. Captain John Seymour, the lead investigator on Nora's case, went so far as to bring in a handwriting analyst and review over 30,000 pieces of handwriting in an attempt to get the signer of the lease agreement at Sutter Street. Despite having what he thought to be a match with 4 different men who could have filled out and signed the lease, all 4 men were quickly ruled out and were found to have nothing to do with Nora's murder. One of the handwriting samples reviewed in the investigation was that of a man named Charles B. Hadley. Charles Hadley was a seemingly random man who had embezzled money from his employer and then disappeared right around the time that Nora's body had been discovered. When the police went to a local hotel to arrest him for the embezzlement, they found only the woman he had been staying with, named Ollie Blazier. Ollie was interviewed by the police, but had no information to give them as he had walked out on her and never came back without any warning at all. The day after she was interviewed, she returned to the police station, though, this time on much more serious business. It turns out Ollie had seen the handwriting samples that were published in the newspaper and brought with her a sample of Charles Hadley's own handwriting and swore that they were one and the same with the killer. The police studied the samples and actually ended up agreeing that the handwriting was a definitive match for both C.B. Hawkins and the mysterious Mr. Bennett. She gave more information as well, which would convince Officer Kaida that the men were all the same man, using numerous aliases all around the city, and who had murdered Nora Fuller. She explained that he had a love for tenderloin steak and that she had come across some clothing of his that seemed to have blood on it right after the murder. She said his entire personality changed around the time the body was discovered. He had begun to act very strangely and even anxious, especially when reading about the murder in the papers. Although he had a clean-shaven face, Ollie explained that Charles had numerous fake mustaches he liked to wear all the time, very much like those both Mr. Bennett and C.B. Hawkins were described as wearing. Detectives had a picture made up where they put a mustache on Mr. Hadley, but when shown to witnesses who knew what the other man looked like, the results unfortunately were inconclusive at best. The owner of the popular restaurant was very adamant that the man in the picture, Mr. Hadley, was definitely not the man who had frequented his establishment, whom the staff had dubbed Mr. Tenderloin. Captain Seymour was more than convinced, though, that all three men were one and the same, and that all three names were aliases. There was a manhunt undertaken for Charles Hadley, whose real name they found to be Charles Start, and he was wanted for embezzlement in Minneapolis as well. He was never found. In March of 1902, a pharmacist named Charles Seifert was arrested for embezzlement, and Captain Seymour, after reading into the man's criminal history, was convinced he was the one who had murdered Nora. Charles Seifert had befriended a friend of Nora's around the time of his arrest, whose name was Emma Searight. It was nothing more really than a series of uncommon coincidences that led to Mr. Seifert being considered a suspect in Nora's murder, though. He had been staying at the Winchester Hotel, but had left without paying his bill, allegedly in a hurry, the same week Nora was known to be killed. He chose that same period of time to shave off his mustache for the first time in a very long time. He was known to prefer the company of younger ladies, those we would consider today to be minors, and he had a penchant for fine dining. Charles Seifert was even a customer at the popular restaurant on many occasions. According to witnesses, though, this man bore almost no resemblance to the other two men who were believed to be one and the same. There were also no similarities in the handwriting. He was ruled out as quickly as he was ruled in as a suspect, and the press had a field day with this information. They reported that this was basically a pathetic attempt to pin the murder on a random man in the interest of covering their tracks for grossly mishandling the investigation into Nora Fuller's murder from the beginning. No other person was ever on record as being a suspect in the murder, and tragically, Nora Fuller's murder remains unsolved to this day. Well, there you have it, folks. What do you think of this sad case? Who do you think the murderer might have been? I look forward to your comments, but please keep it friendly and respectful. Till we meet again, be good to yourselves and each other. Stay safe out there. As for me, I'll see you a little farther on down the trail. I'm Steve Stockton, and I'll talk to you next time.